Well, shall I get started?
Yeah, go ahead. Thanks,
All right.
Randy.
All right. Yeah, I don't want to keep people waiting. Well, good evening and welcome to Learning by the Lake, which is a monthly webinar sponsored by Wells College. We do this on the second Wednesday of each month, and I thank you for joining us. My name is Randy Kissell, and I'm presenting a talk that I've titled The End of Heavy Metal, How Aluminum Saved Civilization. And maybe I got you with the heavy metal, or maybe I had you with that saving civilization stuff, but whatever got you here, I'm glad you're here. But before we get started, I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself and why I'm talking about aluminum. I went to work out of college as a structural engineer for the Pittsburgh Des Moines Steel Company on Neville Island in Pittsburgh. And to train engineers, PDM would send them on various assignments. And one of my first assignments was to work in the plant, which was a 50-year-old steel plant on Neville Island, tracking down gas leaks during the winter of 1976, 1977. And after that winter, when PDM said they had an opening down in their Texas fabrication subsidiary, which dealt with aluminum, I quickly volunteered and found myself in Texas by 1978. We must have had a labor shortage down there because I quickly became the engineering manager. And as the engineering manager, I was responsible for hiring drafters, engineers, cost estimators, and the like. And these were the days before human resources. We didn't have human resources. We just had employees. But I knew nothing about HR anyway, so it didn't matter. And I was responsible for recruiting and interviewing potential hires and really didn't know anything about that. So I read a magazine article that said it's good to get an interviewee to talk about themselves. And one way to do that is to ask them what their biggest weakness and their biggest strength is. So the first guy comes in to interview, and I'm kind of fumbling around thinking what to say. And then I remembered. And so I said, "So, what's your biggest weakness?" And the guy responds right away and he says, "Oh, my honesty." And I was a little taken aback by that because I thought, that's strange. But I said, "Well, I don't think of honesty as a weakness." And he said, "Yeah, like I care what you think." So, at the risk of showing my biggest weakness, I'll be honest with you. I haven't had a chemistry course since high school. I'm not a metallurgist. And I don't know a lot about a lot, but I have learned a lot about aluminum during my career. Along the way, I've learned a bit, and I'd like to share some of that with you. But before we proceed, I want to thank Wells College for sponsoring this presentation and note that Wells recently enjoyed its 150th anniversary. It was founded in 1868 by Henry Wells in Aurora, New York, which is a beautiful village on the eastern shore of Lake Cayuga in the Finger Lakes region of New York State. And I'll also mention that Henry founded, in addition to the college, the American Express and Wells Fargo companies still in existence today, as well as a college for women, which was really kind of a radical notion at that time. Now, this might be a radical notion too, but I've always thought that the most important things in history had nothing to do with wars and treaties and tariffs and stuff like that. And I remember in school being forced to memorize the dates of things like the Hay-Buna-Virillich Treaty and the Smoot-Hawley Act. And now I think that was kind of a waste of time. It seems to me that what's a lot more important is what was life like for people in the past? What things did they use in everyday life? And so if you take this view, materials are really the thing that define history. And really, before recorded history, that's about all we know about those times. So for those times, even historians will talk about materials. If, for example, the Stone Age, when the most important stuff was made out of stones, the best stuff they had. And then later on the Bronze Age, when people figured out that copper and tin put together made bronze and it was real handy for tools and weapons and things. And then later on the Iron Age. It took longer for iron to be used because it had a higher melting point and you needed better technology to utilize it. But even though now we've got written records, I think that materials are still important. And I would suggest that today we live in the aluminum age. Now, it didn't really start that long ago, and it's not over yet. And it's been said that aluminum became the first metal to attain widespread use since the prehistoric discovery of iron. So that's a pretty big statement. Let me explain a little. Well, first of all, what is aluminum? You can see it on the periodic table, and I'm not going to get too technical with you here, but you see that aluminum is number 13, and it's up near the top, which means it's light. In fact, it's the lightest material you'll ever hold in your hand other than maybe a chunk of magnesium, because the other stuff is just too exotic and rare. But all those old age materials like copper, tin, and iron are a lot heavier, and you see them down lower on the chart. But because aluminum, or because iron is the main ingredient in steel, and steel was the material of the 19th century, heavy metal had a really long run, and it was big even recently, and not just in rock and roll. So it's been a long time for those heavy metals, and only recently for aluminum. And before we leave the chart here, you might note that gallium is the next element beneath aluminum on the chart. Now, as an aside, if you've ever been curious about the elements, and you probably haven't been, but maybe after you hear about this book, you will be, I recommend The Disappearing Spoon, which was written by Sam Kean. This guy is a real science nerd, but he has interesting things to say about all of the elements from actinium to zirconium. And he recounts how Dmitry Mendeleev came up with the periodic table of the elements in 1869. And he hypothesized that there would be an element that was right below aluminum on the chart, and he called it eka-aluminum, and he predicted what properties it should have from his theory of this periodic table. Well, Lecoq-Bois-Baudran discovered eka-aluminum in 1875, which is what Mendeleev called that spot on the chart. But instead, he named it gallium. He's French, and Gaul and the Roman or the Latin word gallium is more appropriate for him. And he reports that it has different properties than those predicted by Mendeleev. Well, Mendeleev apparently had a lot of chutzpah, because he tells him to try again. You must have made a mistake. And sure enough, when Baudran goes back and rechecks his calculations, he's forced to admit an error and report the corrected values that do agree with Mendeleev. But the really cool thing about gallium, and it comes into account in the title of Sam's book here, is that it's a great prank for chemists, because they serve tea to unsuspecting guests with spoons made of gallium, and gallium melts at 86 degrees Fahrenheit. So when you put the spoon into the tea, it dissolves. But back to aluminum now. It turns out that aluminum is the third most plentiful element in the Earth's crust, after oxygen and silicon. In other words, after sand, dirt, there's aluminum. And it's more concentrated in certain clays, like those that are at Les Baux, which is in southern France. And that's why aluminum-rich clays are named bauxite to this day. But aluminum is everywhere. And it occurs naturally as an aluminum oxide, a white powder that you see in the middle of this slide here. And it's a very hard material. And in crystalline form, it appears as corundum, which are the semi-precious stones like rubies and sapphires. And it's so hard that aluminum is used as an industrial abrasive. But the problem is that aluminum and oxygen are very tightly bound together. And it was really hard to imagine that aluminum was a metal, because you're so used to seeing it as an oxide, and harder still to extract that metal from the oxygen to produce a metal. Now, the Romans, though, were pretty smart guys, and they hypothesized that there was a metal in clay, and they called it alumen. Alum meant bitter in Latin, which tells me that they made somebody taste dirt to find out that fact. But that being aside, the story goes that the Roman emperor at the time of Jesus Christ, Tiberius, had vast stores of gold and silver. But one day he's approached by an alchemist, alchemist being part chemist, part magician, who shows Tiberius a shiny light metal that he said he had extracted from clay. And the alchemist said this metal was far more precious than gold or silver because it was so much more difficult to produce, and he was the only person who knew how to do it. Well, Tiberius immediately throws the alchemist to the lions because he doesn't want to jeopardize the basis of his fortune. And I guess you could say that the alchemist also discovered that honesty was a weakness, and aluminum was lost to civilization. So fast forward 1800 years to the next attempt to discover or isolate aluminum. We come to Sir Humphrey Davy, who was a pioneer English chemist. Now, Davy had a brilliant career. He discovered, isolated, and named a bunch of elements, other ions like sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium. And he decided that there was a metal in clay, and it was an element, and he named it aluminium, sort of a takeoff on the Russian name. A few years later, he changes his mind. He used to sniff a lot of nitrous oxide, which we know today as laughing gas. So I guess he just changed his mind. But anyway, he proposed that it should be aluminum. But he was overruled by scientific societies in England who preferred aluminium. But the real disappointment for Davy was that he was never able to actually isolate and produce any aluminum, even though he had done this with other elements and he had theorized that there was this metal called aluminum or aluminium. Now, a few years later, a Danish chemist, Orsted, and a German chemist, Wohler, are able to isolate some aluminum, very small quantities using chemical reduction methods that divorce the aluminum from its oxygen bond. But it wasn't until a French chemist, St. Clair Deville, came along, who devised a sodium-based chemical production method that any significant amount of aluminum could be produced. So we went from ounces of aluminum to pounds of aluminum, but hardly very much. And sodium itself was very difficult to produce in those days. And so it wasn't easy to produce aluminum. It was very expensive. But so consequently, Napoleon III, the French emperor, saved his aluminum utensils for his most favored guests at state dinners. And the lesser notables got the gold silverware, which if you think about it is a real oxymoron. But anyway, he also made aluminum into money, which gives you some idea of how valuable it was. Well, what scientists and chemists discovered about aluminum once they had a few pounds to mess around with was that it was very light, but very strong. In fact, if you had a tall enough place to stand, you could suspend a column of aluminum 7.1 miles tall before it would crack under its own weight. Now, engineers call that the specific strength, but I won't get too technical on you here. But I'll just say, don't try this at home with steel because that rusty stuff won't even get up to 3 miles before it breaks. The other things that they discovered about aluminum was that it got stronger and more ductile at low temperatures, very much unlike steel and iron. Not only that, that aluminum oxide that is very hard and very resistant to breaking down would form on the skin of pure aluminum and make aluminum very corrosion resistant. And then finally, which was actually a very useful property for some of the early uses of aluminum, they discovered that aluminum had high thermal and electrical conductivity. It was twice as conductive as copper by weight. So it's the gold standard for conductivity. Well, now let's turn our attention from Europe to America. After his victory over the British in 1783, Washington was rewarded by Congress, who voted to build a monument to his memory. However, if you think that bipartisanship is out the window today, you should have been around in the early days of the Republic because it was just as bad, if not worse then. And it took until 1848 to even get started on the monument. And it was designed as a 600-foot tall obelisk designed by Robert Mills of South Carolina. Well, construction went really slowly, and it finally ground to a halt in 1854 when the money ran out. And it left this stub that you see in this slide here. And that lasted throughout the Civil War until 1877. Well, finally, construction resumed in 1877. It was managed by the Corps of Engineers and specifically by Colonel Robert Casey. And things are moving along, although the Baltimore quarry that they had used for the limestone ran out of stone, and the color of the stones placed later is a little bit different. But as they got near the top by 1884, which was now revised to 555 foot tall, Casey wrote a letter, which you see in this slide, a short note to William Frischsmith, who was a famous foundryman at the time, who was in Philadelphia. And he requested a copper, bronze, or brass cap for the very top of the monument for lightning protection. Now, Frischsmith was a character in his own right. He had emigrated from Germany and was a special agent for Lincoln during the Civil War. And he offers a quote of $75 for a 6-pound aluminum cap, or if he can't do that, he says he'll settle for $75 for a platinum-plated bronze cap. Now, the aluminum cap wasn't even something that Casey was asking for. It was considered way too exotic. And aluminum was going for something like $16 a pound, and it was very difficult to produce in pure quantities. But you got to wonder what Frischsmith was thinking, because if it's a 6-pound cap at $16 a pound, that comes in my book to something like $96, and the quote was lowball at 75. Well, Frischsmith, in 2 weeks, succeeds in casting an aluminum cap at the time when that technology was really tough. In fact, nobody knows how he did it, because when they tested the cap at the 50th anniversary of the monument in 1934, they found there was 97.5% pure aluminum, which is nearly conductor grade today. The unfortunate thing, that was the good news. The ominous news was, and the telegram from Frischsmith was, that the cost of the pyramid was more than calculated. Well, how much more, Casey asked, and Frischsmith says, well, it was $256.10. And Casey nearly has a stroke, because he has to get special permission just to serve coffee to the monument masons working up 500 feet in the air. Eventually, they settle on $225, triple the cost, the original cost. And even then, Frischsmith won't send the pyramid directly to the monument. He first sends it to New York City to be paraded through Tiffany's, and then to Congress for everybody to look at. But finally, in December, that little 6-pound cap was placed, and the monument became the tallest man-made structure in the world until the Eiffel Tower was completed 5 years later in 1889. However, in 1998, and if you were in DC at that time, you might have noticed this, the renovation of the monument used a lot of aluminum scaffolding. Actually, 37 miles of aluminum tube was used in that scaffolding. And I know because I worked with the company that provided it. So obviously, aluminum got a lot less exotic in that time, but how did that happen? Well, the story goes that Professor Frank Jewett of Oberlin College in Ohio had a young prodigy chemistry student. He was named Charles Martin Hall, the son of a Congregationalist minister. And Hall was said to have attended Jewett's lecture, where he said that the person who discovered a practical way to produce aluminum would become rich beyond his dreams. So after Hall graduated in 1884 from Oberlin, he comes home, not having a job, while the Washington Monument is being completed, adding to the lore of aluminum when they place the cap. And Hall decides that he is going to experiment and come up with a way to produce aluminum economically. Well, he sets fire to his parents' house, so they move his operations out to a woodshed in the backyard. But finally, in 1886, in February, he discovers an electrochemical process that greatly reduces the cost of producing aluminum. It's electrochemical in that he first dissolves the aluminum oxide in molten cryolite, and then he passes a current through that solution, and that cathodically separates the aluminum from the oxygen. So you wind up with a little puddle of molten aluminum in the bottom of these graphite-lined pots or crucibles that he had. Now, the only downside was that the process was energy intensive, And at that time, the electrical power generation and grid system hadn't been invented or built yet. So that was a bit of a problem. But we say that Charles Martin Hall might have been the founding father of aluminum, but perhaps the founding mother might have been his sister, because fortunately, his big sister Julia was keeping meticulous records of his work. And that's a good thing, because when Hall finally collects up enough money to go to Washington in July to patent his discovery, he finds out that somebody's already done that in May. And he's heartbroken. But because Julia's record showed that he discovered the process in February, the US Patent Office ultimately is able to issue Hall a patent. But who is this other guy? Who came up with the patent at the same time? Well, as it turns out, unbeknownst to each other, both Hall and Paul Heroult of France had been working on the same problem and discovered the same solution. And this solution is used to this day. So over 100 years later, it's still the best way to make aluminum. Now, the interesting thing is that Heroult was the same age as Hall, having both been born in 1863, but that was about their only similarity. Heroult is sort of the anti-Hall. He's a son of a tanner, not a minister, and he's a bon vivant, and Hall is really kind of the textbook nerd. And so they're different kinds of guys, but they both struggled initially to find commercial backers, and probably because aluminum was so rare that there really weren't many uses for it, any practical uses. And Heroult beats one of his potential industrial backers in a game of billiards, and that sort of scotches that deal. And Hall, meanwhile, struggles to find a backer too. So Hall first tried to get with a potential competitor, the Cowles Electric Smelting Company of Lockport, New York, who were using hydroelectric power up by Niagara Falls to produce aluminum bronze. But they don't work well together, and that's maybe not surprising because Hall is a little bit of a strange guy anyway. So Hall quits and he seeks other backers. Fortunately for him, he runs into Alfred Hunt in Pittsburgh in 1888, who was the guy who started the Pittsburgh testing labs. And along with 5 other steel industrialists, they come up with $20,000 and they found the Pittsburgh Reduction Company. And it's reduction because it's reducing aluminum oxide to aluminum. And Hall starts a small production operation on Smallman Street in Pittsburgh, and there's a plaque outside the place today, and he sometimes works around the clock to keep production going, because once you get that molten aluminum flowing, you don't want it to freeze in the pots and have to blast it out. But unfortunately, the Pittsburgh Reduction Company sounds too much like the American Reduction Company, which are garbage collectors in Pittsburgh. So they got to come up with another name. And in 1907, they decide that it's the Aluminum Company of America. And within a few short years after that, just shorten that up to Alcoa. But the big thing here is aluminum really a solution in search of a problem? I mean, what do you do with it? It is good at conducting heat, so it's great for cookware. And that's one of its first uses, but it's so expensive that Alcoa winds up bankrupting the cookware company that's buying their aluminum. And so they acquire the company for nothing in exchange for paying its bills. And they invent the Wherever Cookware, a brand which is still available today. And they begin the process of creating markets for aluminum. Now, European companies also discovered that adding a little bit of copper to aluminum makes it much stronger. And they call this alloy duralumin, which implies durability. Unfortunately, when you add copper to aluminum, you really degrade its corrosion resistance. And in fact, these duralumin alloys weren't a whole lot more corrosion resistant than steel when they're exposed to the elements. But the Germans also discovered that some aluminum alloys gain strength when they're tempered by heating and cooling processes to get even greater strength. But meanwhile, Hall becomes a little bit more of an impediment to progress than a trendsetter. He spends the rest of his life at Alcoa, most of the time in the lab, trying to work on ways to perfect aluminum production processes. He finally meets Heroult in person in 1911 when Heroult comes to the US to congratulate Hall for the Perkins Award in chemistry. And Hall works very closely with a small, short guy named Arthur Vining Davis. who you may know from the name of his foundation, which is often mentioned on NPR. But Arthur Vining Davis becomes Alcoa's president in 1910, works well with Hall, and so gets promoted. And he serves the company into his 90s. He's chairman of the board until 1958. Hall, though, never married, and both he and Heroult die fairly young at age 51 in 1914. And Hall leaves much of his fortune of nearly $1 billion in today's value to Oberlin College, where it makes up about 1/2 of their endowment today. Now, aluminium seems to be the international consensus for element 13, but a typo in an ad run by Alcoa calls it aluminum, and that sounds better to Charles Martin Hall. And in the United States, Alcoa pretty much calls the shots when it comes to aluminum. And so in 1925, the American Chemistry Society formally goes with aluminum. So in the United States, it's aluminum. In the rest of the world, it's aluminium. And that's the way it remains. So those arrogant Americans have their way. But whatever you called it, aluminum needed to move beyond cookware if it was going to make the impact on civilization that I'm claiming it did. As it turns out, the German Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin had been an observer with the Union Army during the American Civil War, where he saw that lighter than air balloons were used to observe enemy positions in Virginia. And when he retires from the German Army in 1890, he designed a lighter than air airship in 1893 that relied on aluminum to be light enough to fly and filled the rigid balloon with hydrogen. So the aluminum was one of those heat-treated aluminum copper alloys that are still used in aircraft today and had been discovered by the Germans about that time. Meanwhile, the Wright brothers also use aluminum in their aircraft, but the difference is that their craft is heavier than air. Not a lot heavier though, and to keep it as light as possible, they used an aluminum engine, which was quite a novelty at that time. And their first flights were so close to not getting off the ground that you could argue that aluminum made the difference between success and failure. In fact, when at the Centennial in 2003 out at Kitty Hawk here in North Carolina, when they did a reenactment, they almost don't make it either. And they really wonder how the heck they did that. But it was that close. But meanwhile, in 1914, World War I breaks out in Europe. And the Germans use these Zeppelins to fly over the Channel and bomb civilians in England in 1916. And the British just rant against baby killers, and they use this as a recruiting tool to get people to enlist. But really, throughout the war, other than Zeppelins, the airplane structures are still made from wood and canvas throughout the war. Now, after the war, Europe was devastated, but the US economy, having been spared the war and actually having made a lot of munitions and supplies for the armies in the war, really the economy here boomed. And the invention of elevators and advances in steel construction prompted a height race to build ever taller skyscrapers. And this played out in New York City big time in the late 1920s and early 30s. And in fact, it culminated in 1931 with the construction of the Empire State Building. But while these structures were framed in riveted steel, they used extensively aluminum in the framing around their exteriors. And that was the first major use of aluminum in construction. And interestingly, the Chrysler Building, which was erected in 1930, was locked in a height race with 40 Wall Street, the building there, and a rival architect. And 40 Wall Street's architect announced the finished height that their building was going to be, and it was going to be taller than the Chrysler Building. But what they didn't know was that there was a 125-foot tall spire secretly constructed inside the top of the Chrysler Building. It was hoisted out in October of 1929, and it took the crown until the Empire State Building topped out 2 years later. And the spire made use of another novel metal, which was called stainless steel, which is a iron chromium nickel alloy. But by this time in the Depression, Alcoa was coming under a lot of antitrust scrutiny by the feds. When you are the aluminum company of America, there is some reason to believe you might be a monopoly and you might be fixing prices. But at the same time, the Roosevelt administration is anxious to bolster US industry, and they were encouraging the establishment of industry associations to set standards and facilitate trade. And so consequently, growing out of some of those efforts by Roosevelt and the New Deal, Alcoa founded the Aluminum Association in 1933 and based it in New York City, which was the trade and business capital of the nation at the time. Now, the purpose of the Aluminum Association was to address pre-competitive issues, such as establishing industry standards for naming alloys and safety rules and things like that, although there weren't a lot of safety rules in the early days. But today, the U.S. Aluminum Association is the source of standards that are set internationally and puts U.S. aluminum technology really at the forefront of internationally. Now, because aluminum is very energy intensive, it's really advantageous to produce aluminum where the power is cheap. And even during the Depression, Alcoa was cranking out the aluminum because they were afraid if they shut down production, it would be very difficult to restart. You know, once that molten metal solidifies in the production crucibles, you got a real mess on your hands. And Alcoa also feared losing their skilled workforce. So they have some locations near hydroelectric power, near dams, such as Alcoa, Tennessee, where they use that cheap hydroelectric power. And the Tennessee Valley Authority and the New Deal come and follow Alcoa to build more hydroelectric plants and to electrify rural areas, not only in Tennessee Valley, but also in the Pacific Northwest. And those are two areas where aluminum was produced for many years afterwards because of the inexpensive power. But the Depression really dragged on until the outbreak of World War II. And the importance of aluminum to the war effort, particularly in airplanes, did not go unnoticed, particularly by the Germans. And it's not well known, but the Germans had a very spectacular, successful sabotage against the United States in World War I in 1916, before we even entered the conflict, by blowing up a munitions depot on Black Tom Island in the New York Harbor. The explosion was so great that it broke thousands of windows in Manhattan and Jersey City and partially damaged the Statue of Liberty. So the Germans think maybe they can do something again. And in an attempt to repeat that success, in June of 1942, the Nazis land 8 saboteurs on the US East Coast using U-boats. Now, 4 of them, including George Dask, land on a beach in Long Island, where they bury their supplies of explosives that are intended for blowing up the Alcoa mills and hydroelectric plants at Niagara Falls. And notice they were not going to blow up the Pentagon, which was under construction at that time, or the Empire State Building, like a terrorist might do today. So the saboteurs catch a train to New York City, melt into the population. Well, as it turns out, George Dask apparently had second thoughts, or maybe he never intended to go through with it in the first place, because he tries to turn himself in to the FBI in Manhattan, and they think he's a nutcase and tell him to get lost. So he hops a train down to Washington, goes to the FBI there, who have a similar reaction, but they finally accept his story when he shows them $84,000 in counterfeit American money, and they start to believe him. Well, all 8 saboteurs are quickly rounded up based on Dask's information, and Roosevelt is taking absolutely no chances on a civilian court to let any of these guys go, has them tried in a military court. 6 out of the 8 are sentenced to death. They're electrocuted within 7 days, and George and one other guy who cooperated are given life sentences. Wow, justice was a little swifter in those days. But President Truman actually commuted their sentences, the 2 survivors, in 1848 and sent them to the US occupied zone in Germany, but they're shunned as traitors there. So I don't know if that worked out well for them or not. But aluminum was so important to the US war effort. Aluminum scrap drives were held throughout the country. And I remember my mom saying that she peeled aluminum foil off gum wrappers for scrap. And scrap drives were the name for recycling before recycling was cool, but it's the same thing. And Roy Fellham launched Light Metal Age magazine in 1943 to promote the use and application of magnesium and aluminum, with the idea that we were entering this new age that would be dominated by these metals. That magazine is published to this day, and Roy's daughter continues to publish it, and the cover has gotten a little brighter and fancier, but it's still a very
I think we lost Randy. I'm gonna give him a call.
There's Linda.
Jan Old.
okay. Sorry. Sorry about that. Where did we leave? Where did I get cut off?
It was right after the,
After the aluminum foil, the gum wrappers.
there you go.
Okay. All right. Oh, good. So we're just one slide off. Okay. I'm showing an air power slide now. I hope you can see that.
No.
No? Oh, that's
No.
too bad. All right. So let's see here. Let me get back to share screen. Okay.
Mhm.
How's that?
Okay.
All right, sorry about that. I was saying that air power was critical to the success of the Allies in the war. And it's really because aluminum made airplanes and airplanes won the war. It's almost hard to imagine how important this was, but just to kind of give an example, on October 14th of 1943, known as Black Thursday to the U.S. Army Air Corps, the U.S. 8th Army Air Force sent 291 B-17 flying fortresses to attack some German ball bearing plants. And 60 of them are shot down and 600 crewmen were killed or taken prisoner. 17 other planes make it back, but they're so badly damaged that they're scrapped. And so you can imagine the immense loss, not only of aluminum and aircraft, but of human life and the sacrifices that were made. It being Veterans Day, I'm reminded of that tremendous sacrifice very much so today. But American factories are fortunately able to make aluminum planes faster than the Germans and Japanese can shoot them down. And so this really gave us the deciding edge. And it was really Allied supremacy in the air that made D-Day successful and ultimately made Japan surrender. And because the American factories produced a plane about every 4 minutes, produced nearly 300,000 aircraft, including about 12,000 of these F-4U Corsairs that you see in the picture on this slide, one of which was flown by my father as a Marine fighter pilot in the Pacific, and one of which he left at the bottom of the Sea of Japan in May 1945 about 20 minutes shy of making it back to Okinawa. But during the war, the US government required Alcoa to provide aluminum technology and resources to Reynolds and Kaiser so that they could start their own production plants. And they distributed these plants around the country so that if any one area was overrun by the enemy, production could continue. But after the war, there was a real concern that these facilities would no longer be in demand and kind of go to seed and be a big waste. So Alcoa began a real intensive campaign to find other uses for aluminum, particularly in construction. And one of their first big forays into that market was in building the Alcoa Building in Pittsburgh, where they erected in 1953, where they used aluminum in every possible way you can imagine, particularly in the cladding on the outside of the building, referred to as a curtain wall because it's essentially draped like a curtain of aluminum and glass around the envelope of the building. And the Alcoa Building is one of the first to do this, and they use aluminum everywhere. They use it in the elevators, the stairs, the rails, the furniture, vents, you name it, they use it there. And this is a rather interesting picture taken from the roof of the adjacent German Lutheran church, which had used aluminum decorative castings on its roof back in 1926. So a little bit of the old and the new there. But aluminum continued to be used in aircraft after the war, and the de Havilland Comet became the world's first commercial jetliner, and it used an aluminum fuselage just like all the planes in the war did. But in 1954, over a period of several months, two comets mysteriously crashed into the Mediterranean in mid-flight for no apparent reason. They don't think there's pilot error, there's no evidence of sabotage, and it isn't until they dredge up some of the wreckage that they find out that fatigue cracks had occurred at the corners of the square windows in the fuselage. Now, fatigue was a new phenomena to engineers at that time, but what it is in areas of stress concentrations, repeated application of stress, which is less than the tensile ultimate strength of the material, can cause cracks. And so you'll notice that all windows in airplanes today have rounded corners. And if we ever get back in airplanes again, you'll be able to check that out. Now, fatigue, though, proved to be difficult to understand. In 1988, Boeing 737, operated by Aloha Airlines over the Hawaiian Islands, suffered a major failure, as you can see in this picture, of its aluminum fuselage. And this happened at 24,000 feet, and yet it was still able to land. Those are first-class cabin seats that you see right there. And it would be almost kind of funny, except there was an attendant who was swept off the plane and their body was never found. Interestingly, in an interview after landing, one of the passengers said, yeah, she noticed a crack in the fuselage when she was boarding the plane. But the NTSB investigation concludes that fatigue was the problem due to the large amount of takeoff and landings. They do a lot of short hops in the Hawaiian Islands, and they did about 90,000 cycles of stress on that, and it had caused a failure. But kind of on a happier note, steel beverage cans had become common by the 1950s, and the Alcoa in particular really envied that market. But it wasn't until Ernie Fraze, who was an Indiana farm boy, had started the Reliable Tool Company in Dayton, Ohio, came up with an idea. Now, he was doing anything he could to make money, including manufacturing those little trinkets that they used to put in Cracker Jack boxes. I don't know, maybe they still do. But in 1959, Ernie's got his family out on a picnic and he forgets to bring a beer can opener. So he's forced to use the bumper of his car to open the cans. Now, I don't know how he did that, but those bumpers used to be these massive chrome things with jagged edges on the inside. So maybe he was able to do that. I don't know. But anyway, this got him to tinkering on a can that you could open without an opener, but the lid had to be aluminum for you to be able to do that. At first, Alcoa poo-poos the idea when he brings it to him after he's patented it. But when the Pittsburgh Brewing Company sales just soared by putting Iron City beer in Ernie's cans, Alcoa relented, bought the patent, and I guess the rest is history. A little bit of a problem, though, the pull tabs wound up being everywhere. was a bit of a problem, cut Jimmy Buffett's foot and prompted him to write Margaritaville. But nonetheless, as several of my college friends have rightly said, the aluminum beer can surely ranks as one of the most important innovations of the 20th century. Later on, Alcoa came up with the pop top, where the little detachable part stayed with the can, and that was a little more environmentally friendly. Another consumer development was the use of aluminum in all sorts of household goods, particularly things like artificial Christmas trees. There was a company called the Aluminum Specialty Company, and they came out with the Evergleam tree in 1959, and their sales had reached 150,000 a year by 1964 and were soaring. But then the 1965 Charlie Brown Christmas TV special came out, and in it, Lucy tells Charlie Brown to get the biggest aluminum tree you can find, Charlie Brown, maybe painted pink. Instead, he comes back with a pathetically humble but real tree, and aluminum tree sales just tanked after that. But back to the good news, in the 1960s, aluminum was essential to the US space race. And when President Kennedy announced in 1961 we're going to land a man on the moon by the end of the decade, not only was that an ambitious schedule, but we had no idea how we were going to do it. But with aluminum producers' help, the Saturn V rocket was developed. It used over 1 million pounds of aluminum, and it was disposable. So that was a huge market for the producers. And these rockets were really made possible with the development of some new alloys, particularly by a woman named Margaret Brennick of Alcoa, who was the first female welding engineer at NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center. And she did it with pearls on, if that picture is any indication. Now, the early rockets used aluminum plates that were arc welded together, but more recently, NASA has been using a process called friction stir welding, illustrated in this slide here. And friction stir is a welding process that's especially suited to aluminum, and it's incredibly elegant. It was patented in 1991, and I met the guy who patented it from the Welding Institute in Cambridge, England. And the process uses what looks like a drill bit. It's plunged down into the joint between two butted aluminum parts. That bit is rotated and then dragged along the joint, and by friction, it stirs the metal together. And so the space shuttle's aluminum fuel tanks were friction stir welded, as are the next generation Orion rockets. And by the way, those Orion rockets were tested on a giant aluminum shake table, which I was involved with, and has more miles of aluminum welding per pound of metal than anything I've ever seen. And which incidentally had very similar cost overruns to the Washington Monument Pyramid. So what goes to show what 19th century and 21st century, the government operates about the same way. Now, aluminum has also become essential to lightweighting automobiles and reducing carbon dioxide emissions. And really, in fact, without transitioning cars from steel to aluminum, electric cars would really be a long time coming. So that's been a real plus and a real advantage. But using aluminum in cars has had some missteps also. One of the first cars to use an aluminum engine block was the Chevy Vega. And you can see it here in this clearly 1970s ad. I think that young lady is wearing what were called go-go boots. And the Chevy Vega that I used to drive to Wells College in the 1970s burned about a quart of oil for every tank of gas. So engineers have subsequently solved that problem, but they did not in the Chevy Vega. Aluminum has also been used in exploration on planet Earth. And the U.S. South Pole Scientific Station in 2009, 164-foot diameter, and the station was inside the dome. And in 2009, the old dome was dismantled and retired when the new scientific station, which you see sort of in the upper right of this slide, was completed. And the reason that the old dome was retired was on average about 8 inches of snow accumulates each year at the South Pole. It never melts. And so the dome was being continuously crushed under more and more snow. but it's a real testament to the ductility of aluminum that it was suitable at those low temperatures. I worked for a company that also made some aluminum domes north of the Arctic Circle at the Red Dog Zinc Mine. And I've got to say that that was the coldest job site that I ever went to. A 400-foot diameter aluminum dome was used to house the Spruce Goose, which was the largest plane ever built out in Long Beach, California. And it housed it from 1981 to 1990. It's interesting because the Spruce Goose was ordered by the US government as a transport plane to be developed during World War II. To conserve aluminum, it was to be made of wood. And it's kind of ironic that after the war, we had so much aluminum, we could build a structure that was going to house the Spruce Goose out of aluminum. We had so much of it just a generation later. But development of this plane actually dragged out and was not ready during the war. It was ready about 1946 or 47. Howard Hughes took it one lap around Long Beach Harbor, and then it was retired and never flown again. But probably one of the world's most iconic structures also uses aluminum, and that's the Disney World EPCOT sphere. And it has a hidden interior frame, which is actually steel, but it's clad in 1/4 inch thick plastic core aluminum skinned panels, these triangular panels, and has a spectacular look. And finally, and it maybe seems appropriate as we get to the end here, aluminum is the recycled material. I mean, it's so durable that the vast majority of aluminum ever produced is all still in use. But recycling aluminum, when it is done, particularly with disposable products like beverage cans, saves about 92% of the energy required to produce the aluminum from bauxite. And those aluminum cans go from cradle to grave to cradle, in other words, from can to recycling to back on the shelves in as little as 60 days. And they can be indefinitely recycled. Now, for all of those that are in municipal waste or recycling, it's key to recycling of all materials. Well, that's my presentation. I thank you for your attention and for bearing with us under some technical difficulties there. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. I really enjoyed preparing it. I remember that it was sponsored by Wells College, and if you enjoyed it, I hope you'll join me in making a gift to the college. These are difficult times for higher education, and education is transitioning from some traditional models. And I feel certain that Henry Wells would appreciate your support. So I hope that this Learning by the Lake series contributes to ways to make learning adapt to modern times and to new ways of learning. And I appreciate your participation. And finally, I hope you'll join us for our next session on December 9th. It's going to be presented by a Wells alum, Sue Escadal, on networking, and you're cordially invited. I'd be happy to take any questions if people have them. I don't know if I have answers, but I'm happy to answer them. And also, if you would prefer to send an email, there's my email address. Go ahead, Emily.
We did have one question in the chat, which was, why is SpaceX using a special stainless steel versus aluminum for its vehicles to go to Mars?
I'll be perfectly honest, show my biggest weakness. I have no idea. I don't know as much about stainless steel as I know about aluminum, but now that I've been asked that question, I will try to find out. I might hypothesize that it might be in only certain parts of the vehicle or the rocket. Stainless steel is about 3 times as dense as aluminum. And every pound that you put in that has to escape the Earth's gravitational field takes about 3 pounds of fuel, rocket fuel, and costs a lot of money. So they'd have to have a really good reason to use something heavy like stainless steel. But I'll look into that. That's interesting.
If anyone else has any questions, feel free to unmute as well now that the presentation's over, but lots of thank yous, great presentations, very interesting in the chat. So really glad everyone enjoyed it. And we'll have a recording. I was thinking to myself, I will be passing it along to some family members myself who will definitely enjoy this.
Well, good, yeah. And there'll be a follow-up email to everybody who registered, and I'll provide my email address if you want to contact me with any questions. I'll also give you a link to Light Metal Age and a link to the recording. So if there's any follow-up that you want, welcome to do it through that.
Did someone have a, yeah, go ahead, Fiona.
Randy, what else do you know that much about? Because I can't wait to hear about it, whatever it is.
Well, I know a little about a lot, but I guess I'll think about that. I did think there might be some other things to talk about, but I've worked a lot in aluminum in technical ways. I'm a structural engineer, and so I actually get involved in deciding how big a beam has to be, you know, how wide or how deep or whatever. And I knew you wouldn't want to hear about that. So I'll spare you those things.
Well, think of something else, because that was just terrific.
Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it, and I like I said, I hope that this Learning by the Lake series, which is virtual now, can be in person in the summertime in Aurora whenever we get through this pandemic. And I think that'll be even more exciting and even more hands-on, and really looking forward to it. We have a few programs that we're tentatively planning for next summer. And I'm going to be there, so I hope some people are interested and decide to join us.
Another question. Oh, go ahead.
This is Betsy Bovary. Who wrote Disappearing Spoon?
Who wrote it? Sam Kean, Kean. It's really well written, a very enjoyable. Another book that I recommend is a book about the moon program, written in 2019, and I'm forgetting the author, but I think the title is One Giant Leap. It also talks a little bit about aluminum and about the Saturn rockets, and it's very, very well done, and not super technical, but just really interesting and insightful.
Randy, Joe.
I like to read nonfiction.
Randy, can you say the name of the second book again? I'm sorry.
One Giant Leap.
Thank you.
You may be if you want.
We had another question in the chat, which you know, you and Fran might get a kick out of, which was Randy, what were you doing at Wells in the 70s?
That's where honesty is a real weakness. I guess I can't say, but I was a frequent visitor. And I totaled that Chevy Vega in Buffalo on the thruway on one trip. I made it to Wells and I made it back, but then the car was toast. So yeah, they burned a lot of oil. They had an unlined aluminum cylinder, and they use iron linings now typically, but the thing just burned oil like crazy. Really, really bad.
Hi, Randy. This is George Morovich, and I was wondering about the friction welding, because that seems like it's something relatively new. And I'm wondering, is that something that lends itself well to like shop built storage tanks?
Yes, very good. I know George from my professional work. In fact, George and I both worked for that company in Conroe, Texas, where I started my career in aluminum. And I'm glad you could make this, George. That friction stir welding process is really ideally suited to cylindrical vessels. The rocket tanks, the Saturn tank was a 33-foot diameter cylinder. So if you were to see, it's 363 foot tall. So it's a little bit different from a 20-foot tall storage tank, but it's the same concept. And so, yeah, I thought that same thing, that aluminum storage vessels could be made by friction stir welding. And friction stir welding has to be done under shop conditions. It's not really well suited to be being done out in the field because it requires a lot of equipment and jigs and machinery to keep the two parts held tightly together, because as you can imagine, they want to fly apart when the friction stir tool is going down the joint. But yeah, that's a real good observation, George. Maybe you could start a company that does that. Oh, and I'll also mention that Eclipse Aviation out of Albuquerque, New Mexico, has been using friction stir welding in aircraft. You may notice that if you ever get on a plane and you look, if you can see any of the fasteners like around the door or whatever, if you're an engineering type like me, you'll notice there's no welding at all. It's all either adhesively bonded or riveted or mechanically fastened in some way. No welding at all. However, the Russian fleet, the Aeroflot, they weld some of their aircraft together. And I submit to you that I would much rather be on a Boeing plane than a Russian plane. But Eclipse Aviation was trying something new, and they've apparently been pretty successful. They were using friction stir welding, and that's a huge difference between that and arc welding. So.
Yeah, Randy, this is George again. And yeah, certainly 38 years ago, I was honored to go to work for you. And everything I've learned about aluminum, of course, is much of it is from you. But with regard to the reduced allowable stresses, does the friction stir welding, that would have the same issues with a heat affected zone, reducing or potentially cracking there. It's going to
well, yeah. George is making the point that when you weld aluminum, the heat of welding reduces the strength of the base metal. And I'll get too technical for you guys, but reducing that strength in the welded zone from arc welding is a real phenomena, because you have to get the metal up to its melting point, which is about 1200 degrees Fahrenheit. But friction stir welding doesn't get up to the melting point. It only gets up to about 800 degrees Fahrenheit. And so it has a much smaller heat affected zone. And it also produces a much more uniform shape to the weld. And so friction stir welds, while they're not quite as strong as the base metal unwelded, they nearly are as strong. So that's another advantage of them. On the other hand, to get friction stir welding added to welding codes, all the welding codes are staffed by people who make arc welding equipment. And so they don't like the idea of friction stir welding. And so they in fact, the guy who used to work for Alcoa was the chairman of the American Welding Society Aluminum Welding Committee. And when somebody came to him from the aluminum industry and said that, but this guy was in arc welding. And somebody came and said, we wanted to add friction stir welding to the code. And the chairman said, we'll add it over my dead body. Well, we actually got it added, and he died a little bit after we got it added. So we didn't kill him by doing it, but it was some heavy lifting because you have competitive issues and competitive advantages. So that's it's not always the technical argument that wins. Sometimes it's the commercial advantage that's the deciding factor.
Randy, I want to know if you've ever had a stint in radio, because you have a good radio voice. I feel like you could narrate some podcasts.
Yeah, no, I don't think so. I'm not so sure about that. But I don't know. We'll see. Maybe I'll do another one of these at some point, but we'll have to think about that.
And Lisa Young says, speaking for alums in mid to late 70s, we are glad you were a frequent visitor.
Well, thanks, Lisa. Yes, I enjoyed my visits, and that's what introduced me to Wells College, and I've been a fan ever since. Wells does some really great things. They're not an engineering school like I went to, but they do a great job educating people, and I'm a big supporter of Wells. So I'm really glad I came to know Wells and some of its alums.
Awesome. And then someone just said you were on the cover of Structure magazine, so I'm probably going to need a copy of that as well.
That was something like 2013, and there might be a copy around here somewhere, but I'll look into that. Yes. Yeah.
That's awesome. So does anyone else have any other questions? Oh, he was the aluminum ace is what it was.
That is correct. Yes, I wasn't gonna volunteer that, but since it's out there, yeah.
Oh, it's out there. It's directed at everyone in the chat. So
Okay.
awesome. Well, thank you guys. I think you know, as long as nobody else has your sister told on you.
Okay.
As long as no one else has any other questions, I would say that's a wrap. Thank you so much, Randy. That was awesome. Lots of thank yous and compliments in the chat. So thank you all for attending. This was great. I should hopefully have an edited recording up that you all will get a copy of by the end of the week. And yeah, feel free to share. But thank you, everyone. Again, have an awesome night.
Thanks a lot, everybody. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care. Bye.